So hi, everyone. We're going to talk about Yashua Bengio's workshop talk that he gave at NeurOps back a couple of years ago, talking about potential connections between backpropagation as an algorithm and actual ostensibly observable processes in the brain and how neural computation actually works. And I'll have to apologize ahead of time and say that there's a lot of work that Yashua goes over here, and I haven't had time to read every single paper that he mentions or look into the details. So this is going to be a little bit of an informal talk, and I'll do my best to kind of get us to think about what's happening in these models and or just think about these potential connections. And I think this is a good jumping off point for those of us who are interested in these kinds of methods to kind of dig deeper and potentially maybe follow up in another week and just focus on one particular paper. Right. So Yeshua is one of a few folks at Mila who are working on these bridging the gap between these what actual organisms are doing neurologically and what we are doing in our models. Those of you who are familiar with the sort of history of deep learning and how it's been derived from the sort of earliest neurological models, or what it's highly abstracted, right, from actual sort of usable models of what neurons are doing. When you model the action potential in a neuron, and when you model connections between neurons, you're often using sets of differential equations, which are very different from what we work with when we have these deep networks with backpropagation as a training algorithm, these certain activations that we just kind of arbitrarily choose to place onto our models. But there is some potential to find connections between what we've already been doing in this horribly abstracted feat of engineering that we've been doing, that we've shown is useful for all of these these types of problems. We know deep learning is useful. Can we see if there are ways to take a step back and start from the principles of actual neurobiology and try to justify what we've been doing? And you can sort of see in some of the connections that Yashua is already making here in this first slide. He's talking about inspiration for ReLUs in the brain. Potentially, he's talking about inspiration for dropout modules and spiking activity. When I first just heard this introduction, I was like, okay, it sounds like we're kind of taking what we have in this highly engineered space and kind of say, oh, okay, can I go back and come up with some explanation that kind of makes sense? It seems a little bit of an ad hoc way of going about it, rather than starting from first principles in neurobiology and building up abstracted models of computation from there. We're sort of taking this fully built set of engineering tools and saying, okay, can I find some connections here? And it's a bit of a strange way of going about this kind of approach of connecting neuroscience and deep learning and AI. But it's interesting. And there's certainly there's a lot of things that he just goes over here. We talked about ReLUs, dropout, softmax, potentially having relations to lateral connections. I don't personally see that myself, but so this is just a sort of an idea of where Yashua is going in the talk. We're going to be looking at taking backprop, which is a heavily engineered, heavily global learning algorithm for training deep models, specifically in their already abstracted form. And we're going to try to be taking a step back to see if we can actually look at how this can be justified in the brain. So throughout the talk, Yeshua's going through a lot of different models and trying to connect them with the brain. And so I didn't pay as much attention to every single detail that he goes over in these first few slides, because a lot of these are just he's kind of setting up background. And so his initial idea with this slide was that this model for self-attentive backtracking, which I'm personally not familiar with, I didn't read the paper, but it can be somewhat analogous to what the hippocampus does when it stores episodic memory, and is able to create kind of skip connections in a similar way that we have with our with this attention-based recurrent model. I do want to take a pause here and kind of ask people what you're already thinking, just given my little bit of introduction to this. And if anyone's familiar with self-attended backtracking, this would be a good.
I think it is valuable to look at things that work well in practice in terms of and then kind of seeing like, okay, well, is there at least some connection? I do think, like you said as well, I think it's dangerous or not dangerous, but I think it's a little bit oversimplified if you start to directly connect things, because it's just it's, I think, too complex. I think it's good to give people an idea of sort of the abstracted, like systems neuroscience is also, for example, a very abstracted way of thinking about the brain. And I think if you think about it from that level, there are some sort of like very high level functions that you could maybe connect to each other. But I think you always need to be careful in language with these things. Because I agree with you that saying lateral connections are similar to softmax seems like a little bit, I don't even know, where to start, kind of.
Yeah.
Because it's like, it's just a very broad thing to say. Like, I don't know what that means even.
Yeah.
I mean, it's still interesting, right, to think about these things in those ways and kind of connect two fields that maybe are thinking about the same type of things and see if that can be fruitful. I think there have been examples of that it has been. I think there are papers that have looked deeper into how the brain does plasticity based on backprop and things like reinforcement learning with like dopamine connections. I think those have been like interesting. So I think it's good to look at those. But yeah, I agree that
Right.
it's important to
Yeah.
be very linguistically accurate when you're talking about these.
Yeah, I agree. And what Yashua ends up focusing on presenting are algorithms that are related to backpropagation, and most importantly towards this problem of creating efficient global learning algorithms for biologically inspired deep learning models. So if anyone's familiar with the sort of the landscape of more biologically plausible learning, a lot of the learning rules that you end up building for these models are these sort of local, Hebbian learning is a local learning rule for training restricted Boltzmann machines and related models. And they tend to not scale very well in computation. This might be an artifact of our sort of software engineering development and how GPUs and stuff are built to deal with certain kinds of learning rules and computations better than others. But we have backprop as an algorithm, well established as reasonably efficient. With GPUs, it's very efficient in most cases. But we have these other these local rules which we need to sort of work around, and we want to create a global learning rule like backpropagation that is more biologically plausible. Backprop, it will turn out, is not entirely plausible. So there are.
Can I ask something? Does
Yeah,
he talk about
it.
neuromorphic computing specifically? Because obviously one of the holdbacks for deep learning in general is just the fact that it's discrete, where that's like why we've had to make some abstractions away from the brain generally, because it's just not possible to to be able to do like these, like you said, ordinary differential equations like we have about certain like things like the neurons, doing discrete approximations of those is just not feasible in terms of time and computational complexity.
Yeah, he
That's one of the reasons
mentions.
why we wouldn't be using that, for example.
Yeah, he mentions so the main algorithm that that Yashua seems to have been involved with is this equilibrium propagation method, which is sort of a it'll be the answer to this question of how we do global learning in a more biologically plausible way. And he mentions they have a paper published where they have some results for actually doing fully continuous versions of that, which they said could be useful for neuromorphic computing. But this let's just step through the slides a little bit more. So these perturbation-based methods, these neuron centric methods in biologically plausible computing, I've already mentioned, not entirely scalable. They involve a lot of perturbations in individual neurons for computing a single scalar value, and end up being relatively inefficient within our computing framework as they've been standardly formulated. So this is going to be our question, right? How do we do backprop in a biologically plausible way? Backprop pretty much established in literature to not be biologically plausible for all sorts of reasons. This claim there are no labels in the brain ostensibly is an interesting one. Certainly when we're dealing with backpropagation, we have very concrete ideas of what our labels, what our targets are. Of course, backprop can also be used in an unsupervised fashion, so that's maybe not worth thinking about. There's published work showing that standard approaches to backprop through time aren't biologically plausible. There's lots of reasons. I mean, we require symmetric weights in the brain if we would need to do backprop in a biologically plausible way. There's a lot of reasons to work at coming up with a more biologically plausible method. And one of these methods that was published back in ICML 2019, I again didn't really look at this particular paper in too much detail. But the idea is that we can take the activations that are derived from consecutive samples in the backprop, mix up the activations, mix the labels, and this gives us some form of regularization. It's just random mixing of what you're working through in the model. And this gets us away from one of the limitations of backprop, that we need to have perfect synchronization between activations in the brain and observed labels. So this is just one step towards biological plausibility. Let me see. Right. So we're going to step towards this this method for equilibrium propagation that Yashua's lab is focusing on. The sort of basic idea in equilibrium propagation is that the dynamical system that's set up by recurrent connections in the brain is going to have some kind of stable equilibrium. It must, right, in some way. So we are going to be able to use that idea to perform a sort of gating, something like, this is a bit hard to describe. You're seeing my lack of preparedness. Let's just move forward.
I can comment.
Yeah,
briefly
sure.
on that, because those are the fixed point and implicit differentiation ideas.
Right.
So Marinal, Osman looked at it as well. I strongly believe as well that this is, if not the key, but a huge part of the key of what we can do to get closer to real thinking rather than ballistic computation input to output.
Exactly, yeah. And so there's this idea of target propagation with these feedback connections. So the feedbacks within the brain can potentially propagate different kinds of signals, either some kind of positive target or some kind of error after predicting a target and getting a prediction incorrect. And this can be conceptualized as sort of a along this idea of like this, you're spinning and thinking, either being nudged in a feed forward kind of correct direction or standard way that we think about with backprop, or backward, where you're getting errors and you're propagating this error backward, and it gets rotated through this through these feedback connections. And so we should be able to use this idea of these feedback connections, which are spinning these, our standard sort of feed forward connections and backward connections. We should be able to use this to come up with a more biologically plausible algorithm. All right, and so this is just what I was talking about. So let's skip through some of this stuff and just get into equilibrium propagation. So the general idea of what this method is doing is that we have some energy function for the task that the brain is inferring, and we are going to be reducing the energy of in cases where we are making correct predictions, where the computation is going in the way we want it to, and we're going to increase the energy, get away from our local minimum when we are making errors or making mistakes. Oh, whoops. For some reason, I'm getting audio on my end. Just a second here. Okay. So, yeah, honestly, so this is going to be, so we can compute gradients for this energy function so that we can make steps in the desired direction to increase or decrease error. We can inject some Gaussian noise, and this will move us towards good configurations in the brain if we are making correct predictions, right? That's the general idea. So let's step forward.
Wait, I have a question in the previous slide.
Yeah, please.
I'm not sure if that's so. So we are adding the Gaussian noise and then moving. I mean, what's the point of adding it? It should not be.
The robustness, I think.
Oh, okay, got it. Yeah, that was
it's also very much related to restricted Boltzmann networks, because there they just do Gibbs sampling instead of MCMC with an energy function, kind of similar. I don't think they add. So I mean, for restricted Boltzmann machines, the randomness that you inject is sampling from your hidden states, basically. Yeah, right.
But,
So,
but wait,
I mean,
my basic confusion was that you're adding noise in every step. That, I mean, would it not increase the randomness more?
Yeah, but that's good, right? In a way, you become more. I guess in the brain, you would also expect there to be noise by every step, because there's all sorts of noise when you change the synaptic weights of the brain, and I think it may make you more like it regularizes the network. If you think about VAEs, there's a lot of noisiness in your latent space that you're adding, basically. That's also why sometimes they're very hard to train. But that randomness that you add, basically this Gaussian noise, because that's what you're doing, makes it more sort of like stable, and it allows the network to, well, stable in the solution, because it also allows the network to have a larger manifold that it's learned, because it's not fully deterministic. So every point near kind of what you predict should be similar to that point. Otherwise, your reconstruction error is very bad. So it just basically, I think it's more about the robustness. Like, let's say in your brain, you get some noise, and then like your whole thought completely changes. That would be devastating for the brain itself, obviously, because one neuron slight change also affects the the next neuron, affects the next neuron, affects the next neuron, and because they're differential equations, if they would have large effects, that could very quickly result in very nefarious, chaotic behavior. I think part of the behavior in the brain is probably chaotic, but I mean, it would be extremely nefarious, chaotic behavior.
Got it.
Totally
Okay.
out of control. I think that's the point. I mean, I'm also not entirely sure, but I'm just.
Yeah, there's a good question. If if that is the case, it certainly seems a bit strange to imagine that the brain is sort of artificially adding random noise to its signals in order to do that kind of regularization, or to prevent that kind of noise deactivation. So one wonders what the actual biological mechanism would be, and if there's a more a more robust way to actually do that kind of preventative regularization.
I would also think you would add other noise. Like, I think the brain spiking neurons are often considered to be like Poisson distributions. I think not to say that should be the noise that you add, but it's more like Gaussian noise also seems a little bit too simplistic, maybe like chemical noise, or like the fluid noise and stuff like that. Or I mean, it's not really noise, but it would be noise, for example, for updating the synaptic weight. It's probably more complex. But I think it's just that it's an approximation, right? I mean, also I'm probably, the brain may not actually do Langevin MCMC either. I think but it's all like, I think it's just to like add, at least like get closer, right? I don't think he means that this is actually how it works. I just think it's more there is noise added.
And I think hence the title, Towards Bridging the Gap. The gap is not yet bridged. We have simply laid down some of the first stones in the bridge.
So I have a question. How can we get closer to something if we don't know that's something?
Well, I think the differential equations for the neuron are pretty well understood, and they're just talking about synaptic weight.
That is for one neuron. That is my whole question. My whole I talked about how do you know when you got a plausible?
Well, I think so. There's an argument to be made that we will never, perhaps, or we will sort of asymptotically approach a perfect understanding of actual neurobiological computation, but as long as we have some picture of what the brain is doing, it is perhaps better in our supposedly neurological computations to approximate that idea as best as we can. And you're right that there will be some gap, right, in because we are always learning more information about the complexity of the dynamics in the brain. We're learning more information about neurons in the brain, neurons and other parts of the body perhaps playing a role in cognition as well. And there's a lot of complexity that is continuing to be integrated. But the answer to that is that we'll update our bridge. We'll continue building our bridge as the knowledge of neurobiology increases.
Yeah, I think it's asymptotic, and it's not, I mean, it may not be the exact correct direction we're going in. It's kind of noisy, right? We're doing random walks a little bit, maybe towards it. We may never reach it, but it's still valuable to like try to understand it from a high level. Maybe we will not, like Brad said, there's people that say we will never understand the brain like if you really want to understand everything, we need to look at every single neuron, and we'll never be able to do that in conjunction with all neurons in the brain. That's fine, but I mean, it's more like understanding it from a high level may help us, you know, design better algorithms. It may help us understand neurological diseases better. Just because something is abstracted and you make assumptions doesn't mean that it's not helpful in a way. I mean, I also don't think these people are saying that this is how the brain works. I just think it's more like, well, what we were doing previously was definitely not biologically plausible. So how can you make it more biologically plausible?
Yeah. Sergey, you had a point as well?
Yeah, I want to add, if no one else is willing to say anything. So Ashkan, this is how science works, right? We don't know how the universe works, but we're building models that fit the observations. So, okay, we didn't look...
In science before we do that, but we fit the observation. But here, that is, you are changing the model to say,
to fit the
model.
Yeah, you're changing the model to fit the observation, because we know
you fit the model to fit the model that generates the observation, because you want it to be plausible.
The model is the brain. So our world is the brain, and we want a model to agree with what we know about the brain, which means the know part means what we observe in the brain, right?
Yeah, but here the idea is that have a model that not fit the observation, which how the usual science work. It is to have a model that fits the model that we think is generating the observation that we are seeing.
I don't agree with that, or at least I don't see it.
I'm not quite following what you're saying either, Ashkan.
Yeah, like we have some knowledge, right? You're talking about actual sticking a needle and measuring the data, but we know something about the brain that we know exactly that our models that also learn are not doing or not capable. So we're trying to get a model that will agree with what the brain does as far as we know what the brain does. And then we could think, okay, well, biologically, the brain is doing this and our model is doing this and also can learn. It doesn't mean our model is doing exactly what the brain does, but maybe if it can explain everything we know about the brain and also exhibit some thinking behavior, thinking is in quotes, then we can use it as a predictive model and then see, you know, how to correct it if it predicts things incorrectly, what experiments to conduct with the brain and so on. I think this is more along these lines rather than trying to approximate.
I think another example is that while building airplanes, although they're generally kind of like broadly inspired by birds and stuff, we have also understood flight better. You know, and an airplane is not the same as how a bird flies, but it's just, you know, in building something.
Some people disagree
you know, actually,
with that statement.
That is funny. They started when they was working on building plane. They started by building airplanes that work on birds. All of that failed. So they said, okay, that's not how we should do it. So
no, exactly. But so it still also helped us when we were able to actually fly with airplanes. That also helped us understand different ways of flying.
Yeah. I think to point out the difference in the analogy, right, is that with deep learning, we've started with something which is not at all brain plausible. So we are now asking the question, okay, this model that we've been playing with for so long, that we've called neurological, that we've done all these things with, it's not actually neurological. It's an abstracted mathematical model that works well for certain problems. What happens if we try to create a model that is more biologically plausible? Can we come up with learning algorithms that allow this model to train and do some of these tasks that we know our brains or even that just our more abstracted models are able to do? Will this give us a better idea of what the brain is doing? Will this just give us better theories of computation in general? There's a lot to be gained.
Right. The airplane analogy is obviously not perfect at all, but I think more of a concrete example is how we have better models now of how dopamine works in the brain. I think that is one thing to point to that is very interesting. And it came from us trying to engineer better rewards for, deep learning algorithms. And it's not the same in the brain, but it did lead us to find maybe better explanations for how the brain works in terms of dopamine regulation. And it's very abstracted away from each other. They're not the same. I don't think anybody's saying they're the same, but it's still interesting, right? To see if something gets better performance in terms of what we're trying to do with these reinforcement learning algorithms, is that maybe also, does that reflect something in the thing we know is the best at learning, at least from what we're aware of in the universe, basically? Does that reflect something maybe, at least on a high level, in the brain?
Yeah, so good discussion. Let's talk a little bit more about this equilibrium propagation model. So the idea with this model is that all this is doing is that we are trying to sort of answer the question, okay, how can we come up with a local learning rule that is similar to what we do in something like Hebbian learning, but where we can compute error gradients in a computationally feasible way to update weights in our model in a way that's similar to backpropagation, where we have separate paths for forward propagation, backpropagation, and it's computationally more efficient than what one has to do with a model like Hebbian learning. So let me see here. So the idea is that we will have, let me skip forward to a later slide. Did someone have something to say, or was that just my audio coming back in again? Okay. So the idea is that we have these two phases of updating our energy functions. So we are moving with this forward kind of perturbation where we are moving towards a desirable local minimum in the energy function. And then we have a second phase where we are putting an error or observing an error in the model and spinning it through these recurrent connections and updating the energy function in a way that increases the total energy in the system, right? So we are dealing now with this idea that we're actually updating the actual function that we're working with in this this sort of two-phase process that is very similar to backpropagation. I know this is a very sort of high-level description of what's going on with equilibrium propagation, but the idea, I think, is relatively straightforward. Does anyone want to talk about that? or do we? Yeah, I think it would be worthwhile to have a future talk where we dig into one of these methods in detail and look at all of the nitty-gritty, because I'm sure there's a lot that gets missed in these survey talks.
Well, I wonder, in terms of like this equilibrium propagation, I think it's really cool. I also wonder if it is actually more robust, and because that's something that I noticed, I think maybe other people as well, with neuroimaging data, especially because it's so noisy and sample deprived, basically. Whether if you can find methods that are actually more stable in terms of the dependence on initial conditions, that would be awesome. And it seems like, at least intuitively, but you need to know, obviously, empirically for that as well, whether this is more robust in terms of the solutions it provides, or the equilibriums, actually.
Yeah, I'd like to take a look at this paper in detail and any of the subsequent work they did on it, because in this talk, Joshua doesn't really talk about any actual results as far as I saw. So it leads me to believe that this is just a step towards a more biologically possible backprop, and that's all it is, right? It's just an algorithm. It doesn't have promising results yet, as far as I saw. So I mentioned early on that there is, for biologically plausible backprop to be actual biologically plausible, we would require symmetric weights in the model, which is not what we would are likely to observe in the brain. All that Yeshua mentions about this deal is that they were able to train with asymmetric weights, and it trained fine. Their equilibrium propagation model. I didn't look up into this claim at all. I imagine this archive paper has more on this this actual claim, but the Yeshua just says that you can train equilibrium propagation with asymmetric weights. It comes up with training solutions that work. That's all he says. So this seems like an empirical result to me that they are that he's mentioning. Okay. So this is what Eloy was asking about early on. So so this is getting towards a continuous time physical system that performs computations using this this equilibrium propagation method. So let me see. So I believe all that Yeshua is arguing here is that equilibrium propagation is a method which could be used in a continuous time system. See, he actually has a theorem, I think. Here is more the more interesting one. So they actually did some analog experiments with circuits, and they showed that you could compute the gradients for the voltage across across these resistors in a way that is similar to the gradients that you get from equilibrium propagation. So this is a step towards the sort of neuromorphic computing continuous time system algorithm or continuous time system method for doing this kind of learning. So at least it is interesting on that in that respect versus when you're computing these derivatives for backprop, they're not able to do this. Anyone have any comments on this? Sort of, it's an interesting result. Again, another paper worth looking into.
It does seem pretty general. I don't know how much this relates to
I looked at the
equilibrium propagation. Exactly. I mean, to me, this just looks like they applied Ohm's law, and then I don't know. I would need to look into it further. Because they're just talking about voltage differences, right? And then they're saying like, oh, in the limit.
Here goes, right? Because it's a network. So how they come to equilibriums through the network of connections with different resistance.
No, sure, but so I don't understand exactly what they mean by this result, because I think this is pretty established, right?
Yeah, I think again, Yeshua is just making the claim that this kind of result should be generalized and should come up with a gradient that is similar to what we get with equilibrium propagation in a network. But he just mentions
No,
it.
yeah. No, yeah, it would be interesting to read the paper. I just more like this theorem specifically seems more general than just equilibrium propagation.
I think you're right. Yeah. So there is some other work which Yeshua mentions here, which is interesting, but which I didn't look at in too much detail as well. But the claim of the paper was that pyramid neurons in the actual signals that they propagate with respect to seeing neuron-specific errors could be analogous to backpropagation in at least in terms of the kind of forward and backward signals that we see within these neurons. So again, this is just something that he mentions offhand, so it'd be something that would be interesting to dig into more detail. So the idea is that these pyramidal neurons might play a role by forward propagating signal and backpropagating some kind of neuron-specific error that plays a role in global computation. Now, this is very far away from the promises of equilibrium propagation and full network training, but it at least is potentially interesting to look into for building up a global model of learning where you have individual neurons which are actually forward and backward propagating some kind of signal. And let's see, my videos start playing again. All right. So there's another paper, so this Naden-Spreckler paper from 2018, another one I think that would be good to look at in a future talk. So this is a step in that direction that I mentioned with looking at networks of pyramidal cells. So they are looking at burst forward signals and bursts of backward error between the apical and basal dendrites in pyramidal cells, and showing that this could be potentially a plausible model for a method of neurological computation if we are looking at population bursts in these pyramidal cells, or at least a plausible model of learning. So another interesting paper to look at. And then, right, so this is some of the more recent work that Bengio and his lab have been doing on this differential target propagation. I didn't honestly look at this paper at all, so I'm not going to speak to it, but it's worth looking into. And Yeshua argues that we can use some of these highly abstracted ideas from equilibrium propagation and other more biologically plausible methods for neurological learning to actually perform some set of real brain experiments. He had this interesting point where he says that when we're looking at several trials in a study of the brain, we should be able to come up with an idea that the neuron activity indicates some level improvement at the next trial, and we should be able to improve again the neuron firing configuration at the next surprise, at the next update to the weights, right, in the brain. Now, this is a bit of an interesting claim. It's not entirely clear to me what these experiments would look like, because I don't know what a sort of improved neuron firing configuration would look like experimentally, and how you would be able to objectively measure improvement at a 100 millisecond interval. If anyone has thoughts about actual neurological experiments, or knows more about the kinds of concrete signals we could use to measure this kind of improvement, I'd be interested to hear it.
Well, when you mean actual brain, do you mean the actual brain, or like only the images or the data set that we've been using since a long time?
This is Yeshua's proposing that we can use this this idea of equilibrium propagation, where you're slightly nudging the energy function with each iteration. You're slightly improving the configuration of the energy function to be more well suited. That this should actually be reflected somewhat in real brains. So we should be able to see some improved firing configuration in a real brain. So we would stick in probes, or have a functional MRI or something, which would, I don't know if
I think he's specifically talking about population neuron, like calcium imaging maybe, or stuff like that.
Exactly.
Or just, sticking in nodes. because he's talking about the neuron activity. I mean, fMRI is coming a long way, but I think we're pretty far away.
Yeah,
still.
we are still far from maybe even population neuron activity, but
I think that's the gap that they're talking about anyway in the whole slides that we need to cover.
What?
sorry, can you repeat that, Mernal? I didn't understand what you said.
I'm saying that's the gap that they're talking about.
That's
in
the
this whole
gap.
talk. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, certainly there's a gap. We don't have, when we observe learning in the brain, we don't have any real idea of how to do this with computational models right now. That is the gap. And this equilibrium propagation is a step along with these like basal pyramidal neuron-based models for coming up with computational methods that approximate what the brain is doing.
And I think one gap here is also, how would you design something like this, right? Because being able to
That's what I was
basically
asking.
create a task, basically create a task for like a population of neurons is super, complex.
Yeah, we have a good set of tasks for things like motion and things like, but for actually measuring improvement, I still don't. I have no clue what that would look like. Maybe that's just my lack of neurobiology flaring up, but yeah, I'm
exactly.
not entirely clear what that would look like.
I guess, I mean, what he talks about in terms of improving is maybe like a lower energy state.
That's
like you said, the hard thing is how do you measure a low energy state? I guess there would be ways to like look at, like the differential equation like of single neurons, but it's like you said, but I think that's also, I mean, the point may be a little bit right, that this is really hard, but if we can achieve something like this, then we can get a better idea of how it works on a neuron level, the changing in weights and stuff. But it's really, really hard.
Yeah. So, and that's the note that Yeshua ends the talk on. We have about 5 minutes left here to talk about any other controversy. I'm sure that there's a lot, because I very high level skimmed over a lot of this stuff and didn't talk about any detail. We would not have had time, and also I did not have time to read every single paper in this talk. But yeah, let's talk a little bit more. I guess. Yeah, do any of you have any other thoughts just about the models that we work with? What are potentially things we could do to think in a more biologically plausible way? Would we actually benefit from that? Are we fine working with our abstracted efficient models that do, CNNs are so damn popular because they do computer vision almost perfectly, and they're great, right? So why would we want to do anything that's biologically plausible if we have a model that works? There's lots of questions, and I see the chat's flaring up too.
So I think we should not do this, but the issue is that I think it is signal and system, so we do not know the system. Right, everything that we know about the system is signal based. So essentially, we do something and see the output of that system. We do a task, we do something, but all of that is essentially trying to map that system, which is the brain here, to get something. But that does not give us the system. That's only will work right for LTI systems. Brain is not LTI. So that is what I meant, that doing this for something that we do not know, because observations that we have are not the system; they are passing.
Well, so when you say we're
not really trying to get the system either, like an abstraction of the system, I think.
Yes.
But
so Eloy is right, but we also, when you say that we don't have an understanding of the mechanisms in the system, that's not entirely true, right? We do have very good models of what neurons do at a single level. And we have models of what graphs of neurons with the correct differential equations of what these can do in very simplistic situations. you're right that we don't have this for like most things beyond that. but you know,
that is what I don't understand. So these things are expensive, right? We have limited resources to spend on science, right? But doing these kind of things, which are very expensive, right? They use a lot of GPUs and a lot of other things. It's just a waste of effort. I think it's a waste of effort. That's what I think. And the system, because the understanding of us from the system is so basic right now. The system, not the observation.
I don't agree with that though. I think that's a very engineering way of looking at how all our knowledge about the brain. We have like thousands of years of knowledge. I mean, it's like saying we don't know anything about the universe because the universe is so big.
Thousands of years of science about the brain.
No, we maybe have
even Plato started about the brain. I mean,
yeah. You know, so I think there is a lot of value to be gained by getting a more complex understanding of what the brain is actually doing, and I'm not entirely understanding
absolutely.
why.
I'm saying this isn't the way to do that, and even if you get it, it's not
I agree with you. I agree with you partly, Ashkan, that but I also don't think the main goal of this is just to understand the brain. I think that the main goal of this is to just have a better idea of how learning works and being able to implement that in machines. And it's not just saying, oh, we want to understand, because we've been saying this before. It's not, nope, we don't even know if we are ever going to be able to understand the brain. And nobody is saying that we are. It's just more like maybe if we make it more similar to what we think the brain is currently, and that's going to change over time. So it's not perfect. We all know that. Maybe then we can get better learning systems. I mean, the end goal is not just understanding the brain, it's twofold. And the other fold you're just kind of not talking about, but that's also part of the problem. And yeah, it's very expensive, and we should maybe be held more accountable for those things. And I don't agree with that at all. I don't disagree with that at all. It's, yeah, we know we don't know enough about the brain, at least to have good models about it on this very large scale. But I guess also saying like very little about the brain, it's just like, yeah, there's just a lot to know about the brain. We know a lot about the brain, but there's like way more to know about the brain. That's the problem. I think it's like saying to an astronomer that we know nothing about the universe, and they will say, I mean, yeah, I guess, but I mean, we also know a lot about it as well. It's like both things.
Yeah, and it certainly is funding intensive, but that's what I would write in my grant when I'm requesting more funding, is like, give me more money to do this stuff, because it's interesting and there's more stuff to be learned. And why do people spend so much money on making weapons when we can learn more about the brain? Come on, like there's way more interesting questions to ask for fractions of the funding that get put into other parts of the world. So it's expensive, yes, but we can learn a lot potentially, not only in neuroscience, but in computation, and more abstractly, and in machine learning as a field as well.
The same goes for rocket science. I mean, in terms of, but I agree with Ashkan that it's obviously it's kind of like aiming into the dark, because like Ashkan said, we don't know, how the brain works.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I wonder then, what would your approach be, Ashkan?
So I always talk about this. I think things like engineering in general, right? Sergey said that every science is reverse engineering. I absolutely disagree. Science is not reverse engineering. Some part it is reverse engineering, right? But a lot of it is not. It's forward engineering, right? And look, for things that are as sensitive and as complex as the brain, I think we should do forwarding. We should not do a feedback to essentially trying to come up with a system that models the brain as best as it can. That is, I always call it a loop, like a loop, right? It's a loop in science, but we cannot do that because at every step there are a lot of observation, and all of their observation are error, there are reductionism, everything. So I don't think for something like brain, we should do that. This kind of way of doing that, do it for, I don't know, anything, right? For example, self-driving car, right? Something that we understand how to drive. Humans understand how to drive, right? Or many other systems that we understand. Communication, right? Communication is designed by us. We understand it. So let's use it to improve that and become or
So-
plausible, whatever that means.
So
But
I would argue, and to temper what Sergey said a little bit, I agree that science is not just reverse engineering. It is, as you said, forward engineering so that we can discover. We need to discover things first. That's like the important thing. We need to observe the brain. We need to treat it in all its complexity and all its subtlety and all its fragility. And that requires, that is what neuroscience proper should be aiming to do, right? We make observations, and we use these observations to come up with mechanisms about what the brain is doing, and that's the reverse part, coming up with mechanisms. When you come up with a mechanism that is attempting to describe what a neuron is doing, it is a model. It is a model. The differential equations are models. They are, the best models we have because they are able to predict neuron activity pretty precisely, but they are still models. And this way of modeling with coming up with learning algorithms for networks, it is a different kind of modeling, but it is still a modeling, and it gives us a way to talk about mechanisms of learning that are it does it in a very abstracted way at this point, but I agree. I mean, the forward engineering part is absolutely necessary in order to be able to come up with models that make sense.
I also agree with that. I will say though that I think top-down sort of engineering, or at least science, can also inform the directions you want to take in terms of forward engineering, forward science, right? Because, and I'm not saying that neural networks are a good way, by the way. I'm not, just in general, like we have so many choices to make in terms of forward engineering the brain that sometimes, for example, if we understand systems neuroscience better, we can maybe inform people that are doing research on populations of neurons or neurons themselves. Hey, it may be more fruitful to go this direction than another direction in terms of trying to forward engineer the brain.
And to
But
temper
I
that,
generally agree.
it
I
can,
think,
to temper that, it can also lead to bias, which we should be aware
Yeah.
of, right? Yeah.
oh no, exactly. Yeah, and I think that's also, I think one thing that Ashkan is probably also referring to is that
Yeah.
these models are still, even neural networks are not very well understood. And they are
Yeah.
they're huge abstractions away from the brain, and then we're kind of just saying, oh well, see, they have good performance on these tasks, let's just completely use that as information for the brain. I don't think that's the right approach either,
I agree.
but I do think that there is an argument to be made that if you have models that are doing very well at, for example, image classification or image recognition, that it is interesting to see whether at some point they do reflect similar, I guess, like activations, like V1, comparing that to like neural networks. I do think that's interesting. I don't think that means that the brain does that, or that helps us completely understand the brain. I'm of the idea that we may not ever be able to get an abstract understanding of the brain,
Yeah.
but that's fine. Do I think that we should lead every top-down approach for neuroscience with neural networks? No.
No,
And
no.
do I think it's largely based on hype? Yeah, I do. But there are some interesting ideas. I mean,
that is
and I
how
agree.
it is. That is what is happening now. So,
Well, yeah.
No, I agree. So I agree with you in that respect for sure.
So it is like, that there are some they found some planets based on a physical model, right? They said, oh, there should be a planet here, right? But then after a while, they observed that planet. That is not a feedback, because they used a model, right, to say there should be a planet here, right? And then, because it was very principled, and then later observation was made on it, right? But now in this kind of work, we are doing a leap, essentially a feedback. We are feeding information into our model and essentially changing that model based on that information that we get. The issue is that that information is noisy. And I'm not saying Mila group, I mean, they are very good. They are a very good group, right? They are one of the best. But the issue is that probably 95% of others who does this, based on my other observation in deep learning, they are not doing it as principled as that one group that does it correctly. And
I wholeheartedly agree. I wholeheartedly
also
agree.
agree with that for sure.
And
Yeah.
it is a whole waste of money.
There's a lot of noise. There's a lot of noise in for sure. I think
We find neuroscience.
Yeah,
where
I
it's
for sure agree with that.
issues
And I think there was a talk at a neuro conference, neuromatch
So I
conference,
think it's both.
where they were
I think
also
I
saying
find
like it's
neurons being
there's a lot of papers now being published on the visual cortex relation to like convolutional neural networks. And there was one paper that was like, yeah, but it why?
So, yeah.
Because let's to be honest, based on like animal models and like very small models, we kind of understood visual cortex 1 pretty well already. And it's fun that there's a connection, but
Yeah, it's
okay.
it gives people sensational headlines, and that's why they yeah. And that kind of research is not the kind that we would advocate for by all means. You know that you know
Not
but
to dunk on people that do that research, but more like the question is more like,
I know.
I agree with you, Ashkan. We have a lot of resources and we should go about it structured, and not kind of very ad hoc.
That's
Oh yeah, this maybe this blah blah blah. Because for example, what do you think about the I know I've been using this example a few times now, but the dopamine models we now have about the brain that were partly, very loosely, by the way, based on some engineering that was being done in the reinforcement learning community. Which,
I
by the way,
don't know what I don't know what you are talking about. So I work in addiction and the dopamine. I know that they have a lot of finding based on real-time fMRI and stimulation. I don't know, but you are saying that they found a lot more from a reverse engineering than from for example, something like real-time fMRI. See, for example, we used to do real-time fMRI and trying to make people control their emotions, their cravings, and then you can calculate the amount of dopamine, etc., 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 and you see finally calculate their craving. Something
the
like
idea
that.
that dopamine release is based on what you expect to get. So like if you get less than what you expect, it's not based on how much you get, but how much you expect to get. So if you expect to get $100 and you get 1,000, or if you expect to get 0 and you get 100, that's that idea of the fact that dopamine may be released like that comes from the observation that it works really well in reinforcement learning models that are very good at playing games.
Yeah, I mean, even if it does, it's like gambling. It's just a waste of money. So I think it is a gambling. It's a shot in dark.
So reinforcement learning does other stuff besides give us useful interpretation.
Absolutely.
It just
no, exactly. Yeah, no, I'm not trying to say that that's the only reason we do reinforcement learning. I think that's actually a pretty principled field because they start with playing games, and then that's the main focus, obviously. But it's more like when they found that they were really good at playing games, better than humans, at least in terms of like chess and Go, they were like, okay, well, why?
I think if we asked Yeshua or anyone working on this kind of work at Mila, they would probably say, our goal is not just to tell neuroscientists what to study by creating our models. That's in fact very far what their goal would be. But if they can come up with something useful for neuroscientists, great. But it's a nice benefit in addition to creating better models, rather. Yeah.
So it's not the issue with Mila. That's what I was quite clear.
Right.
Data science has a lot of issue, but the best group and data scientists, they don't have that issue because they understand what they are doing. The issue is that 95% of other people who come into data science, they do not understand and use these tools. And then that 95% is literally garbage. That's what I mean.
Oh no, 100%. And I think actually or not 100%.
I don't know if I would call them garbage. That's
exactly.
You're on record, Ashkan.
But
sorry about that. It is very
sorry to 95% of data scientists. I think one thing that one very famous biologist in neuroscience was talking about is that she was very she was like, wow, because a lot of her postdocs told her that they wanted to use deep learning because it was good for their CV in case they wanted to work somewhere else after. And she was like, I don't see why they would even need that because what we're doing is biology. And, it just didn't seem applicable. But because of the hype and because of, like you said, there is a lot of financial incentive, people have started doing it just to do it as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's,
Yeah.
I think, not good. I agree with that. For sure. Yeah, look, I mean, even looking back at my own research, that it creeps in. And I think it's good to acknowledge that and make sure that it doesn't happen again. You know what I'm saying? But in a way, it's hard to escape politics and money incentives in science currently. You know what I'm saying? It sadly, because it shouldn't be that case. I for sure agree.
Yeah.
But it's almost a political thing, right? It's the same with quantum computing. Like a lot of money, and then some of the papers that were fundamental in quantum computing, not to say that quantum computing is not doing well, but there's some fundamental papers that had to be retracted because they publicized things that were overhyped and turned out not to be true. And you need to create the correct incentives for science. I agree with that, Ashka.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's
Absolutely.
made your point, right? It's like,
Yeah.
we should be doing, good science and not just because it's financially beneficial just for our careers.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Wholeheartedly agree.
just doing something because it's based on it be good on your CV and you can get hired for Meta or Facebook or whatever. It's not a good way to do science. That is absolutely not a good way to do science.
Oh man, if
That's very fair.
if my goal in science ever becomes to be hired by Meta, I hope someone will fire me immediately. All right. Well, I think
There's even a question. There's even a question if you would want to, let's say that after the stop.
Yeah. But I think we're well over time. But thanks for everyone for talking. This is a very high level talk. I hope some people got some inspiration to at least look at these methods and to look at them critically and to look at them for what they can offer us in various respects. I think there's a lot to potentially be gained and a lot to potentially question for sure. So I'll stop the recording here.